Welcome to the Deep Dive, brought to you by Reformed Thinking. We take these dense, incredibly structured arguments from theological history, and we try to unpack them together.
And today, we're really getting into the mind of Jonathan Edwards.
We are. We're looking at his observations on what has to be one of the most logically airtight passages in the New Testament, Romans chapter 5, starting around verse 12.
Oh, it's a cornerstone passage. It really is. This is where the Apostle Paul just systematically lays out the doctrine of original sin.
Right. The universal ruin that comes from Adam.
And crucially, the astounding superiority of justification that comes through the free grace of Christ. I mean, if you want to understand federal theology, this is the blueprint.
Okay, so let's set the scene. Our mission for this deep dive is to get our heads around the logical necessity of Paul's argument, as Edwards sees it. And that starts with a really fundamental question. Why Adam? Why does he start there? He's writing to an audience, especially a Jewish audience, whose entire identity is wrapped up in Abraham. So why does Paul bypass the patriarch to go back to the common father?
That is the pivotal question. And Paul's use of Adam, it's not just a history lesson, it's a masterful rhetorical strategy. He's actually engaging in a polemic. He's trying to dismantle spiritual pride. His argument is like a chain of logic that has to move his listeners from any shred of self-confidence.
Any sense that they have an advantage.
Exactly. From that belief to a state of absolute necessary dependence on grace and grace alone.
Because if the Jewish listener believes their connection to Abraham gives them some kind of, natural hedge against corruption,
then the gospel becomes less vital, doesn't it?
yeah, it becomes a helpful option maybe.
But not the absolute necessity.
Yeah.
So Paul has to establish a condition of universal ruin that comes before and really swallows up any supposed advantages from the Mosaic covenant or the Abrahamic promise.
So the goal for you, listening, is to get a really clear picture of why Paul has to jump back past Abraham, the father of the covenant people, to Adam, the father of all humanity.
And to do that, you first have to understand what Paul was up against. Edwards lays this out so clearly. He calls it the correction of false confidence. The sources show the Jewish perception was centered on this really proud opinion of themselves.
What did that look like in practice? What did that pride consist of?
Well, they sincerely saw themselves as favorites of God, uniquely set apart, inherently holy, and they looked at the Gentiles, the non-Jewish nations, as, unholy by nature.
Doomed.
Doomed, yes. Specifically because they didn't have this privileged lineage from Abraham. They thought the covenant with Abraham had somehow purified their bloodline, giving them a kind of moral high ground.
It's like they thought because they held the deeds to the house, the very ground underneath them was sanctified.
Yeah. That's a fantastic way to put it. But you can see how that belief created this massive strategic necessity for Paul. He had to convince them that their position was just as desperate as everyone else's.
He had to show them that they were, as he says, by nature as sinful and as much the children of wrath as the Gentiles.
Their heritage gave them zero moral immunity.
So, okay, if Abraham is the source of all their distinction, Paul has to get them to look somewhere else entirely. He has to sort of change the family portrait they're looking at.
Exactly right. The strategic shift in ancestry is his key weapon. He directs their gaze away from their distinct privileged father Abraham and forces them to look at their first father,
Adam,
the common father of mankind. He's the shared starting line for everybody, Jew and Gentile, no exceptions.
That reframes the entire debate right there.
Yeah.
It's no longer about your recent prestigious history for the last few thousand years.
No.
Paul is demanding they assess their spiritual status based on their original history.
And that one move accomplishes the whole task of equalizing the ruin through this higher ancestor.
So by tracing the family tree back past the glory of Abraham to the calamity of Adam, they all arrive at the same common source of inherited ruin.
Correct. Adam is the biological and, more to the point, the federal root of both groups. So by identifying him as the origin point, Paul proves that both Jew and Gentile alike come from a sinful father.
Right.
And from that father, they equally derive guilt and pollution. The pride of being a child of Abraham, it just can't wash away the contamination you inherited from Adam.
But Paul knows his audience.
Yeah.
He knows that's a tough pill to swallow. So he doesn't just rely on this theological assertion. He points to an observable, undeniable consequence that affects everyone in the room.
And that is the sheer genius of Romans 5. The observable proof is death itself. Paul points to the fact that death, which the Jews knew and accepted as the proper punishment of sin, the wages of sin, Well, that death reigned over Abraham's descendants just like it reigned over the rest of the world.
So the question becomes, if your connection to Abraham made you holy, why did you still die?
Exactly.
The presence of death in every Jewish household becomes this brief, irrefutable piece of evidence that their connection to Abraham did not exempt them from the guilt inherited from Adam.
It connects their immediate, observed reality to the ancient theological premise he's making.
Let's use that analogy we talked about. It really helps. You have these aristocrats, right?
Yeah.
The descendants of this wealthy founder, Abraham, and they believe they're immune to a local famine.
Right, and Paul comes in as the expert forensic investigator.
And he explains that the crisis isn't because of poor policies on their particular estate.
No. The problem is the water table itself is poisoned. And that water table was contaminated by their original ancestor Adam long before their wealthy estate or its founder Abraham ever existed.
So the contamination is in the fundamental source of life that they all drank from, regardless of the prestige of their particular house. The supposed cleansing power of the grandfather's estate, Abraham, becomes totally irrelevant when the poison comes from the very first human source, Adam.
And with that, Paul achieves his first goal. He equalizes the Jew and Gentile under a single universal condemnation.
And once that common ruin is established, the ground is finally level for him to introduce a common, necessary salvation.
Which flows directly into his next point.
Okay, so the argument moves from the universal source of contamination, Adam, to the universal standard of judgment that condemns him and all his descendants.
And this is where Edwards just brings so much legal clarity to the text. The sources tell us the Jews viewed the Mosaic Law, the covenant from Sinai, as the prime, grand, and indeed only rule of judgment. Their whole legal universe was governed by what happened at Sinai.
And that belief creates a huge theological problem for Paul's argument. Because if condemnation only works under the law of Moses, then what about everyone else? The Gentiles or the people who lived before Moses?
They'd have a legal escape route. Yeah, if the Mosaic Law was the only standard, then the Gentiles were sinners for not having it, and the Jews were holy for having it. So Paul has to clarify the real universal standard, what he calls the law of nature. Edwards also calls it the original law of works.
So this law of nature is far older, far bigger than the Ten Commandments.
Oh, absolutely. Edwards is so careful in dating this law. He says it's a far more ancient date than the law of Moses. It began, in his words, as early as the human nature began.
Wow.
And it was established with Adam as the covenant head, which means it was established with the entire human race in him. This is the standard of perfect righteousness that God put in place at creation itself.
Which means humanity before Moses wasn't lawless. They were just governed by a higher prior law.
Precisely, and that really clarifies the scope of judgment for everyone. We have to get what this law of nature actually contains. What was God demanding of Adam that then becomes the standard for all of us?
And what does Edwards identify as that essential requirement?
Well, its content really boils down to the main rule, which is a supreme regard to God and his will. It's a demand for a perfect heart-level obedience, love, loyalty to the Creator. It's the requirement for total holiness.
Okay, so if that's the grand universal rule, then how does this seemingly small, almost arbitrary command in the garden, don't eat this one fruit? How does that relate to this massive law of nature? It feels like a point of friction.
It's a key distinction to make. The command about the forbidden fruit was what Edwards calls a positive precept. It was given specifically to try Adam's compliance with the bigger, broader, intrinsic law of nature.
So it was a test case.
Exactly. The law of nature demanded Adam show supreme regard for God. The forbidden fruit was the specific test of whether Adam would submit his will to God's will, even over a small, seemingly arbitrary command.
So when Adam broke the rule about the fruit, it wasn't just, a traffic ticket. It was high treason. It was a fundamental violation of the entire law of nature that was established over all humanity.
It was an act of rebellion against the constitutional requirement for perfect loyalty. And because this law of nature has universal scope, the Jewish claim to uniqueness just evaporates.
Right.
Unlike the Mosaic Law, which was a particular law for the Jewish nation, the law of nature is the highest and universal rule that Paul says is inherently written in the hearts of the Gentiles. It's the standard for all mankind, everywhere, in every time period.
Which puts the law of Moses, historically and legally, in a very specific secondary role.
And clarifying that role is vital. The law of Moses was superadded later. That term itself is so important. It was added on top of an already existing legal structure.
It wasn't the original source of condemnation?
Never. And it was never intended to be the method of justification either.
So if the law of nature already condemned everyone, what was the point of the Mosaic Law? Why bring in a new set of rules if the game was already over?
Well, its purpose was twofold. First, to illustrate and confirm the law of nature, which had, grown dim in the understanding of fallen man. And second, it acted as a schoolmaster to prepare people for grace.
How so?
By posting those specific strict rules, the Mosaic Law, it clarified the absolute, unyielding holiness God required. And that clarity, in turn, exposed the depth of the sinfulness that was already in their nature. A sinfulness they got from Adam through the original broken law of nature. It showed them just how far short they fell of God's pristine demands.
It's almost counterintuitive, then, that the Jews seized on the Mosaic Law as their source of justification instead of seeing it as a mirror showing their condemnation was already a fact.
That was the fatal spiritual error that Paul was trying to correct. They mistook the diagnosis for the cure. They lost sight of the law of nature.
Let's use that analogy of the Constitution versus the specific statutes. That makes this historical layering really clear.
Okay, so the law of nature is like the immutable constitution of the entire kingdom. It was established at the kingdom's founding, and it requires total, ultimate loyalty to the king. All citizens, everywhere, for all time, are bound by this foundational document.
And Adam broke this constitution.
He did. Now, the Mosaic Law is like specific regulatory statutes posted centuries later, but only for one particular province, Israel.
Yeah.
And while those statutes clarified what was expected in that province, every citizen was already legally condemned for treason against the Constitution, the law of nature, long before those specific statutes were ever posted.
So the law of Moses didn't create sin. It just illuminated the pre-existing inherited guilt that all humanity already carried under the universal law of nature broken by Adam.
It just clarified the depth of the initial wound and the proof that the superior prior law existed and that the wound was universal. Well, that's seen in the next logical point, the reign of death.
So Paul has locked down the universal source Adam and the universal rule, the law of nature. Now he brings in the observable, physical, undeniable evidence. Death reigning over humanity during that long, silent period before Sinai.
And this is such a powerful appeal because the argument rests on a truth the Jews already understood. It was axiomatic for them. Death is not a random biological process.
No, it's a penal evil.
It's the proper punishment of sin, the wages of sin. If someone dies, it means they have been judicially sentenced. They are looked upon by the great judge as sinners.
So if we accept that death is a judicial fact, the carrying out of a sentence, then wherever we see death, we have to infer that there was pre-existing guilt.
Exactly. And the historical observation Paul makes is that death reigned universally during that long interval from Adam to Moses.
And that time frame is critical.
It's everything, because it was a period when the specific law of Moses, which the Jews mistakenly thought was the source of judgment, had no being. It didn't exist yet.
This is the crux of the logical necessity, then. If there was no law of Moses, how could people be condemned and suffer death? Paul uses a legal principle here to really drive this home.
He does. He relies on the principle that sin is not imputed when there is no law. You can't be found guilty of breaking a law that doesn't exist.
Right.
Therefore, the fact that men were condemned, proven by the reign of death before Moses ever posted his laws, demonstrates the existence of a superior, prior, divine rule.
The law of nature.
The law of nature. The reign of death from Adam to Moses proves that guilt and the desert of ruin became a universal inheritance immediately after the fall.
So the reign of death is like a historical witness testifying to the reality of the law of nature.
It functions as legal evidence, recorded in the history of the world. But then Paul takes it one step further. He focuses on a specific vulnerable group whose condemnation just completely refutes personal responsibility as the sole cause.
And this is the definitive proof in Romans 5.1c, right? The case of those who had not sinned after the similitude of Adam's transgression. Edwards identifies this group with such precision.
Yes, he's unequivocal. This group refers to infants, specifically infants who died during that long interval before they were even capable of committing personal, actual sins.
And Paul uses this group because their suffering of the ultimate penalty, death, it can't possibly be explained by anything they did. They simply lack the ability to rebel against God personally.
Exactly.
Okay, let's spend a minute on that phrase, similitude of Adam's transgression. What's the distinction Edwards is making there to explain inherited guilt?
Well, Edwards points out there are two different ways a person can be like Adam. The first is what he calls the likeness of nature.
Okay.
This is the derived corruption, the inherent moral pollution and bias toward evil that's inherited from a sinful root. Infants possess this. They're born with a propensity to sin.
And the second way to be like Adam.
The second is the likeness of act. And this refers to the conscious, volitional, actual sin of violating God's covenant personally, the way Adam did when he willfully disobeyed a known command.
Exercising his own free moral agency.
Right. Infants lack this latter similitude of act. They haven't yet chosen rebellion.
So the distinction is between a corruption of character, which is nature, and the commission of a crime, which is the act. And the death of an infant proves that the corruption of nature by itself is sufficient grounds for condemnation.
That is the inescapable conclusion Paul presents. Since infants suffer the punishment of death, despite lacking personal, actual sin, their death is plain proof that they are reckoned as sinners.
And the only logical reason for that.
The only one is that they bear the corruption and guilt derived from Adam, their federal head.
This argument is just devastating to anyone who believes that justification comes from personal merit or from lineage, whether you're Jewish or anyone else.
It completely removes any possible claim to merit or innocence. Think about it. If condemnation required an adult, conscious choice to sin, then infants would be the only truly innocent class. God's justice couldn't touch them.
But the undeniable fact is that death reigned over them.
Therefore, their guilt has to be derived from the initial foundational offense of their federal head, Adam.
And it just shatters that Jewish exclusivity one final time. Because if the source of condemnation was not having the Mosaic Law, then an infant dying before Moses would be innocent. But they suffer the penalty anyway.
The problem isn't external, a lack of a specific law. It's internal and constitutional. It's a derived nature.
Let's go back to our quarantine analogy.
Okay, so we're observing a quarantine zone where no specific safety regulations, no law of Moses have been posted yet, but everyone is falling ill.
Right.
Then we notice that even the newborn babies, the infants, who have never had the chance to read or break a single safety rule, they're also falling ill and dying.
Which proves the sickness isn't caused by breaking new rules later in life.
Exactly. It proves it's an inherited genetic condition, a corrupted nature passed down from the very first patient, Adam.
It proves the problem is rooted in a federal connection and in nature, not just in personal moral choices or cultural distinctions. The foundation of human ruin is now complete.
And with that universal ruin, derived from Adam's federal headship, now proven by the reign of death, Paul immediately pivots to the only adequate solution.
Christ.
He introduces the federal headship of Christ, establishing Adam as a figure of him that was to come.
So Paul's argument here, it hinges entirely on this mechanism. How can the actions of one person be legally applied to an entire group of people? We have to look at this parallel structure, the mechanism of the two heads.
Well, the essential resemblance is their role as public representatives, as fathers to their respective groups. The mechanism is imputation. The parallel confirms the principle. If ruin can be legally derived from one public head without any individual action,
then restoration can be derived from the other in the same way.
Right. And this is the doctrine of imputation confirmed. Legal guilt and standing come from the first Adam, and righteousness and legal standing come from the second Adam, Christ. They function as sources of opposite influences, but the method of conveyance is what Paul sets up as the parallel.
And this is where we have to address the critique that always comes up.
Yeah.
How is this fair? How does Edwards defend God's justice in imputing the guilt of Adam to billions of descendants who weren't there? For the modern mind, the idea that a passive infant inherits guilt for a crime they didn't commit feels unjust.
It's a necessary friction point. And Edwards doesn't view Adam as just some passive historical figure. He is the public person, the root of humanity. Edwards sees God's establishing Adam as the federal head as an act of perfect wisdom and justice.
How so?
God established a covenant with the entire human race in Adam. So when Adam sinned, the whole race was legally considered to have sinned in him because he was representing their will and their destiny.
So it's not just that Adam sinned, and then God decided afterward, okay, I'll make everyone else guilty too. It's that when Adam acted as the representative of the collective human will, his act was the sin of all.
That's the critical distinction. The imputation of Adam's guilt is the legal consequence. It leads to condemnation. And that's distinct from the derivation of moral corruption, which is the pollution and fallen nature passed down biologically.
Got it.
Both guilt and corruption come from the fall, but they're separable concepts in Edwards' theology.
So because Adam was established as the root, the moment the root poisoned itself, the entire legal standing of the tree was corrupted, and the nature of all the subsequent branches was also corrupted at the same time.
Precisely. His legal standing was our legal standing. And this mechanism confirms that salvation has to operate the same way. Christ acts as the new, flawless root. And his righteousness, his perfect obedience to the law of nature, is imputed to those who are in him, regardless of their own imperfect actions.
Okay, so now we can look at the opposition, the massive contrast and the consequences. What did the type Adam actually convey into the world?
The type Adam conveyed sin, guilt, and the sentence of death. Edwards notes that through Adam, sin entered into the world and judgment came upon all men to condemnation.
Mhm.
Humanity is left in this state of absolute weakness, exposed to divine wrath and without strength. The ruin came through the shattered original law of works. The inheritance is a double tragedy, a judicial condemnation and a corrupted nature.
And the antitype, Christ, is the complete reversal, and then some.
The antitype Christ conveys righteousness, justification, and eternal life. Where Adam left humanity in condemnation, Christ provides the full remedy. Through the sheer grace of God, believers receive a gift by grace that results in justification and reconciliation.
And this restoration operates entirely through the free grace of God.
Standing in direct, massive opposition to the demands of the law of works.
This really underscores the catastrophic nature of Adam's offense as the corrupted root. Paul's not talking about a minor slip-up. He's describing an existential, legal disaster.
It was the event where the offense of one man became the sin of all. The guilt of that one offense is legally derived to all mankind.
So what was the specific legal consequence of that first catastrophic break of the law of nature?
When Adam broke the law of nature, the penalty applied universally because, as their representative, the law was established with the entire human race in him.
Right.
The result is that, in the judgment of God, all sinned when Adam sinned. They became judicially exposed to that death and final destruction, which is the proper wages of sin. Without this mechanism of federal headship, Paul's argument in Romans 5 just collapses. The universal reign of death has no logical basis.
The tree metaphor really becomes necessary to grasp the full scope of it.
It does. Adam is the poisoned root. His initial offense introduced contamination and legal guilt. And since every subsequent generation naturally grows from this initial poisoned stock, all life that comes from it is infused with the poisoned sin and inevitably suffers the consequence death.
The prestige or the lineage of a later branch, like Abraham, can't purify the foundational stock.
It's impossible, and that brings us to the grand design of it all.
We have to bring this argument home by focusing on Paul's ultimate theological agenda in Romans. Every piece of this, Adam's sin, the reign of death, the law of Moses, it's all deliberately orchestrated to achieve one overwhelming goal:
Establishing absolute dependence on Christ.
So Paul's central design isn't just to establish ruin, but to use that ruin as a pedestal. He wants to demonstrate the absolute dependence of all mankind on the redemption and righteousness of Christ, and by doing that, magnifying the Redeemer beyond measure.
Absolutely. The universal ruin is necessary to exalt the cure. Paul has to first establish the utter hopelessness of the disease. He paints mankind as ungodly enemies exposed to divine wrath and without strength.
Because if humanity had any remaining strength, or any shred of holiness left,
They wouldn't need a Redeemer who provides everything.
right, that rigorous, detailed picture of ruin, the deep dive into Adam's offense and the reign of death, it's necessary to prove that justification has to be through Christ's righteousness alone.
It stands in total opposition to the law of works. If we could save ourselves or even rely just marginally on our personal obedience to the law of Moses, Christ's grace would be demoted to a helper role. But Paul shows the debt is too massive, the inherited corruption is too pervasive, and the law is too strict. The only hope is a holy, external, imputed righteousness.
But the magnitude of Christ's work, it goes beyond just canceling a debt. It advances to something far superior, something Paul describes as grace abounding beyond restoration.
Edwards stresses this point so heavily because it speaks to the glorious surplus of the gospel. Paul views Christ's benefit as far greater than the misery which comes by the first Adam.
So if Christ merely restored humanity to Adam's initial innocence, the benefit would only equal the loss.
It would, but justification does so much more.
So it's theologically and logically inconsistent with Paul's argument to say that Christ's benefit only restores man to the state of innocent Adam. That misses the glorious excess of grace.
It certainly does. And what is the nature of this abounding grace? Christ brings not just a removal of guilt, but a surplus of positive blessing. He grants a title to eternal life, a security and a status that Adam never possessed, which leads to a glorious reign of grace.
Mhm.
When Paul uses the phrase abounding of grace, he's trying to communicate the sheer potency, the overwhelming generosity, and the permanence of the cure. It exceeds the original deficit in every possible measure.
It's a new covenant life secured by the second Adam, which is superior to the conditional life that was offered to the first Adam.
The security alone is greater. Adam's holiness was conditional and finite. The righteousness secured in Christ is eternal and absolute. And this grand design required that the law's function in glorifying that grace had to be clearly understood.
So how was the law of Moses, that specific secondary law used in this whole architecture of grace?
It wasn't a theological competitor to grace. It was a strategically placed tool in God's plan. The law was superadded to the law of nature, specifically so that the offense might abound. And that is a stunning theological statement.
God introduces a law specifically designed to make sin increase.
Not that God causes the sin, but that the law functions to reveal it, to clarify it, and to intensify the consciousness and guilt of the sin that was already derived from Adam.
Okay.
By holding up God's perfect, strict standard, the law exposed the depth of human sinfulness. It took the inherited poison and made it visibly, catastrophically clear in every conscious action. It multiplied the specific ways in which people were violating the standards of the law of nature.
So the law is like a high-powered microscope. The disease was always there, inherited from the root, but the law makes the full extent of the infection visible in every single cell, proving the terminal nature of the condition.
And this intensification of the offense has one glorious, ultimate purpose. It was all done so that where sin abounded, grace did much more abound.
The more hopeless the diagnosis, the more glorious the physician.
That's it. The darkness of the inherited multiplying sin only serves to highlight the miraculous nature and the overwhelming glorious abundance of the grace provided in Christ.
So the entire journey of Romans 5, from Adam to Christ, is structured as this necessary theological preparation.
It really is. It's Paul, acting as the ultimate doctor, proving this terminal hereditary condition, Adam's sin, that affects the entire human family, Jew and Gentile alike.
And he does all of this to convince the patient mankind that they desperately need the surgeon who is Christ.
And that surgeon provides a cure that not only eliminates the disease, but grants a permanent guaranteed status, a health far more vibrant, glorious, and enduring than Adam ever had before he fell ill.
It's a logical design that progresses from universal derived condemnation to absolute dependence on an abounding sovereign grace. As we wrap up this deep dive into Edwards' analysis of Romans 5, let's just summarize the three core connections Paul establishes to magnify the sufficiency of Christ.
Okay, first, Paul used Adam as the common ancestor to equalize the condemnation of Jew and Gentile. He showed that lineage from Abraham offered no exemption from that universal inherited ruin.
Second, the undeniable, observable reign of death, especially over infants, proved universal guilt under that superior prior law of nature, which came long before the specific law of Moses.
And third, Paul contrasted the two federal heads, Adam and Christ, showing that Christ's sovereign grace doesn't just rescue humanity from the ruin derived from Adam, but far exceeds it, granting believers a superior eternal reign of justification and life.
We talked about how the reign of death over infants who committed no personal act of sin is really the definitive proof of derived guilt. So since the penalty of death fell on those passive newborns, how does this doctrine, which links the fate of billions to a single ancestor's transgression, inform our understanding of God's perfect justice and sovereignty, particularly when we view it through the glorious lens of the grace provided in Christ? That's a challenging and vital question for you to consider as you reflect on this deep dive.